Okay, thank you everyone for being here early on the very last day of our conference. I am delighted to introduce Isobelle Barrett Meyering, who is a Macquarie University Research Fellow and who put forward this excellent and really timely idea for our plenary session this morning, which calls us to reflect on, I suppose, I was going to say commemorates, but I'm not sure that's quite right, calls us to reflect on the anniversary, the 30th anniversary, if you can believe it, of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And she has put together a fabulous panel of people who are going to speak from a range of really interesting perspectives on that today. So I hand you over to Isobelle.
Thanks, Nell. So it's a pleasure today to be chairing this session. Thank you all for making it this morning, and I hope you all enjoyed the conference dinner last night. The panel is really going to be a blend today of discussion of policy, advocacy, and history, and really there were kind of two purposes I had in mind when I proposed the panel. One was to take stock of current debates about children's rights, focusing on the Australian context, and secondly, to think about how historians of childhood and youth might contribute to navigating these debates in the future. So I'd like to start today by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Guringai people and by paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to recognise this land was never ceded and that the question of sovereignty is one that really does connect closely to questions of childhood in Australia today, as I think Sana really reminded us yesterday. I'd also like to thank the organisers for agreeing to have this session. I'm currently working on a history of children's rights in Australia, which is why this topic is obviously one that's pertinent to my research. But I did think that with the anniversary of the convention taking place this year, that it was a great opportunity at this conference to reflect on the historical significance of the convention, its adoption and its subsequent ratification by almost all member states of the United Nations, including Australia. Of course, the history of childhood and youth has grown in the same kind of period of the last 30 years, and I think it's not a coincidence. We're ourselves products of some of the thinking around childhood that also was a driver behind the convention, not least of all the idea of giving children a voice, and I hope that's something we can come back to in discussion. So today we're going to be hearing reflections from both scholars and those working at the front line, and hear about what they think of the significance of the convention. For those who are not familiar with the convention, it was adopted by the United Nations in 1989 after a period of lengthy negotiation, lasting 10 years after the International Year of the Child in 1979. It, of course, wasn't the first international statement of children's rights, but it was far more comprehensive than its predecessors, the League of Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child and the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child. The convention touches on many of the subjects that we've been discussing at the conference, from the right to education, to the right to play and leisure, to the rights of refugee children and adoptees. And some of you might recall that in the first plenary on Wednesday, that Nanette Long actually referred to the convention as a tool of advocacy for her network. While the convention, of course, has a global history, this panel is going to focus on the Australian context. And I hope that that's both instructive for those of us from Australia and also for those visiting. I'm sure there are also connections to debates elsewhere, and perhaps that's also something we can come back to in question time. Australia ratified the convention in 1990 under the Labor government of Bob Hawke, who had famously declared in the 3 years earlier in 1987, in the lead up to election, that no child would live in poverty by 1990. For the record, that was actually a slight mistake in his wording. He meant to say, I think that no child should live in poverty by 1990. But the idea that poverty and child poverty was a question that was on the agenda at the time did frame a lot of the discussions about the ratification of the convention by Australia. 30 years later, there are many questions surrounding the convention and to what extent it's been an effective tool for advocacy. And I think I hope that in the brief time that we have today, we'll be able to illuminate some of the opportunities and challenges that the convention has presented for those working in the children's rights field in Australia. So we have three great speakers to speak to this issue today. I'm just going to briefly introduce them and then get each of them to come up and speak individually. First, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Sana Nakata here again for this plenary. Most of you will have heard Sana speak yesterday, but today she's going to be offering some comments on how her work connects to the question of children's rights, which is a theme that she explores in her book, Childhood, Citizenship, Governance and Policy, The Politics of Becoming Adult. Sana is a Torres Strait Islander who lives and works on Naarm as a lecturer in political science at the University of Melbourne. She's a trained lawyer and political theorist, and she's currently working on an ARC-funded project, representations of children in Australian political controversies. Following Sana's presentation, we're going to hear from Megan Mitchell, Australia's first National Children's Commissioner, a position she was appointed to in 2013. In her role as Commissioner, Megan focuses solely on the rights and interests of children and the laws, policies and programs that impact on them. And finally, joining us from Canberra is Nanette Louchart-Fletcher, the creative producer for museum engagement at the Museum of Australian Democracy. Nanette is the driving force behind the museum's award-winning children's exhibition Play Up, which, as she'll explain, uses the convention as a framework for conversations with young children and families about social justice and personal and collective rights and responsibilities. So the format for today's plenary is going to be slightly different to the previous days. I've asked each of our panellists to speak briefly about their work. We're going to hear from them for about 6 or 7 minutes or so, and how their work relates to the convention, and also sort of what they see as some of the key children's rights issues in Australia today. We're then going to move to a panel discussion, depending how we're going for time, for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll be opening up to questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Sana to speak to us.
Thank you, Isobelle, and thank you to the audience for indulging me on the second morning. I don't want to take up too much space, given that I've already had the pleasure of being able to speak to my work extensively yesterday morning. But as a way of participating in this panel and the discussion that follows, in which I hope to be a sort of good and friendly discussant, I will take a few moments to speak to how I first came to engage in my work on the politics of childhood, which was actually specifically through being introduced to the field of children's rights scholarship as a law student. And in doing that, I'll offer a little bit of an overview around how I engaged with children's rights scholarship, particularly through the stage of my PhD research, which became the book that Isobelle mentioned, and how my work more recently has moved beyond rights to questions of politics, to the spaces in which we continue to contest rights and the ways in which children's rights claims continue to be contested by different kinds of political actors and communities. And I hope in doing that, I'll be able to show both what I consider to be a fundamental and essential and necessary commitment to all human rights, and particularly to the specificities that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child provides to children at what is a very, very important and unique stage of life. But also to call our attention to the spaces or challenges in which rights start to, in which we begin to see the limits of what rights can do in particular settings and moments, and what we can do to push further. So I came to be interested in children's rights because in the very last semester of my law degree, I had the great pleasure of being a student of John Tobin, who is one of the world's leading children's rights scholars. And after a period of studying law in which we were being told to drink the Kool-Aid on the idea that law was the source of justice, and being an Indigenous person in a classroom and not being able to help but feel a little bit cynical about the possibility that law can be justice for all people. It was an extraordinary revelation to sit in a classroom where we were specifically engaged with the question of the limits of law for children who could not represent themselves in legal proceedings. And that was how I learned about the history and the development of children's rights, all the way up to the United Nations Convention. And of course, from John, what I learned was the precision and technical skill required to deploy a rights-based approach to not just rights of protection or rights of participation, but to a broader mode of justice for children and young people. I, in that class, wrote a terrible essay arguing that children should be allowed to vote. I did it the hard way. I thought, I'm not going to argue we should lower the voting age, which we recently had a Senate inquiry on in Australia. I'm just going to say that I think all kids should be allowed to vote as a matter of democratic principle. I did a terrible job. It was not a good essay. And I knew that, and I was not done with the question. So I took that question that was really interested in how we think about what a child is, what a citizen is, what a legal actor is, what a political actor is, and I took it over to the politics department where I was an honours student, and I got hooked and I haven't left it since. So I spent a lot of time exploring the Convention on the Rights of the Child in my PhD, where I was, that PhD took place in 2 modes. I spent a lot of time reading how Western political philosophers wrote about children, in a discipline where we don't tend to pay much attention to those aspects of their texts. So we read a lot about how philosophers developed key democratic principles, but we don't read Locke's some thoughts on concerning education. We don't read Rousseau's controversial Emmy. We read the 2 treaties of government and discourses on inequality. And I was interested in how the kinds of key claims and ideas that came through those Enlightenment texts carried forward into contemporary debates on sexuality, including access to medical consent, as well as ages of sexual consent, criminality, and of course citizenship, which goes far beyond the question of voting. I have more recently turned my mind to how adults represent children in political debates. There are ongoing live efforts to increase and better protect the rights of children to meaningful participation in matters that affect them. This is a fundamentally democratic pursuit. And while that is taking place, and while rights advocates are in the process of creating mechanisms that bring that to life, I am interested in what's happening in the meantime. How are we as adults speaking about and representing the interests of children? And how do we do that in ways that may very well uphold the best interests of the child or their interests, but can also in other ways produce great risk and harm to them. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to being part of the discussion.
So we have Megan speaking next, and I will just get your slides ready, Megan.
Do an arrow or just this thing?
Yes, the arrow.
Or I can do this sort of thing. Yeah, great, cool. Hi everyone. Thank you for having me today. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're gathering on. I want to thank Isobelle for putting this panel together and for inviting me to be part of it. and I want to acknowledge all the speakers, other speakers here, and also all of you for turning up on this last day. Well done. As has been noted, this is the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Australia did sign up to it 19 years ago. I was the first Children's Commissioner, so it took a long time to get a Children's Commissioner in the Australian context, and there were lots of people advocating for a Children's Commissioner since we ratified the Convention. I started back in 2013, and my immediate background is in child protection and juvenile justice, so I come from a work history where kids' rights were breached on a regular basis. So I was already very interested in what we could do to raise the profile of children's rights, especially those most vulnerable in our community. So the convention actually forms the basis of it informs all of what I do at the Human Rights Commission. And, you know, it's very important that I talk about rights, because rights aren't really esoteric concepts. They're really basic preconditions for kids to be okay, like being healthy, having a home, having a house, having a family, getting an education. And this is not rocket science. They're pretty basic things that kids need to be okay and do well in life. And I would say that the convention, even though its implementation, and that's something we're going to talk about, is kind of patchy, it did dramatically change the way children were treated and viewed. And so instead of seeing children as passive and vulnerable, it actually talks about them as empowered and independent. And this reconceptualised the traditional dichotomy between adults and children, and children were not seen anymore as simply subject to adult control. Arguably the most important of the four guiding principles, because it's the gateway to all other rights, is Article 12, and we're going to be talking a bit about this right. And it protects the right of children to have their voices heard and to participate in decision making. It also combines nicely with Article 13, which is about having access to accurate information. In terms of children's voice, though, I think Australia, like many other countries, does struggle to hear the voices of its children, so that genuine and opportunities for children's participation to our social, cultural and political life remain pretty limited. And there are a few reasons for this. Rights aren't really well understood in the Australian community, as human rights generally, and children's rights in particularly not well understood. And they may in fact be a little feared and seen in competition with adult rights. Many children themselves, I've found, do not realise they have rights, but I can tell you when they do find out about it, it's very strengthening inside for them, and they sit up a little straighter, and they feel quite strong about that armour that it gives them that they can put on. And that Australia cares enough about them to have signed this convention that says, we promise all these things to you. And it's why human rights education, especially child rights education, is so important in the role that I'm in. But why should we hear from children? Well, it empowers them. It helps adults get things right, because if you don't go to the source, you're likely to muck it up. Because every day there are policies, programs and laws that are being shaped and decisions being made that directly impact on children. And, we hear about co-design and consumer voice and consumer input, but we don't tend to extend that to kids, even though they're the client of many, many programs, the client or consumer of many, many programs. So from my perspective, privileging the voice of children, listening to what they have to say and taking it on board is also a powerful message to kids about their value. So to keep faith with the convention, when I first started, I went about the country and conducting a tour known as the Big Banter. I called it that to try and make it hip and young sounding, but children were not fooled. No, they were very generous to me, and here's some of the things that they said to me along the way. And as a result of that process, I was able to construct 5 key themes that has continued to guide me in the work that I've done. So, and these are a right to be heard, freedom from violence, abuse and neglect, the opportunity to thrive, engaged citizenship and action and accountability. And this has led me over the years to conduct a number of focused investigations which have resulted in reports and recommendations to governments, and they're particularly in the areas of self-harm and suicide among children, at a national level this is. Exposure to domestic violence, family and domestic violence of children, the treatment of kids in custodial detention, and from that I've been advocating for some time to raise the age of criminal responsibility, and that's actually gathering a bit of momentum at this point, and the needs of teen parents and their kids. So I've done reports, statutory reports to Parliament on all of those issues. And if we look at the last theme there, something that I've been banging on about ever since I started was the lack of comprehensive quality data about the wellbeing of children in Australia. Data conveys a critical part of the story of our children and their experiences. It highlights crucial issues and tells us how big a problem is and which groups of children are more likely to be susceptible to particular issues and experiences. And presently, we don't have data in so many essential domains about children. So our picture of children that we can bring and build is actually incomplete. And for some kids, it's not told at all. These are some of the areas where I found deficits in the data holdings that we have. Child deaths, injury and self-harm, violence against children, outcomes for children in or having left child protection services, children with a disability, things like school expulsions and suspensions. We've got such little information on that. And of course that can be a pipeline into all sorts of other things like entry into the criminal justice system and drug and substance abuse, and in fact access to services as well. And this is something that I've highlighted in my report to the UN that I submitted at the end of last year. And Australia is currently in a process where it's appearing before the United Nations to report on its progress against the convention. So that's a process that I'm right in the middle of, and it does provide us with an opportunity to bring Australia to account in various ways to do with children. What I did in terms of that report is bring together basically the 6 years that I'd been in the role and focusing on the key recommendations from those various reports to Parliament. Plus I asked for submissions from a whole lot of folk out there, and I talked to kids. And that includes a survey of around 23,000 kids through ABC Behind the News, which I've got some slides we can look at later about what they think about their rights, which ones are most important to them, and what they wanted me to tell the UN, which is really interesting. Now, I just did want to say, sometimes we assume nothing has happened, nothing good has happened, but I'm a bit of a glass half full girl. That's me in Geneva. I went over there to present to the committee earlier in the year, and that's that report, which is very UN-y, which means it's not very engaging, but we are going to turn it into something that's public-facing after Australia's appearance this year. But I did want to say there are some positive developments. One, you know, I have this job, which is fantastic, and hopefully that will continue on into the future. The National Children's Commissioner is now something that will be in Australia. There's an e-safety commissioner, although she's not focused on children anymore, and that's probably a good thing, I think. We've had a couple of royal commissions, I think, that have been particularly influential, especially the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. That has led to some work that I'm currently leading in the area of child-safe organisations, which I think is really important because I'm coming from, in that work, from a child rights lens and a strength-based lens rather than a protectionist safety lens. We've ratified the optional protocol to the Convention on Torture, which will allow greater oversight of places like Dondale. And that's really something we really need to lift the bar on in Australia, because these places are really opaque. You know, you can't see into them, and when you get those institutions with a lock and a closed door and a closed window and a blind down, norms change, and you know, the cultural practices put kids at risk. We do have a thing called the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights. That's been established, and that's meant to provide an assessment of new bills that come through the Parliament in terms of their compatibility with human rights obligations. That it's a bit of a flawed process, but it does mean that public servants now have to construct these statements of compatibility, and obviously in doing that they have to find out about what our human rights obligations are. So that is an opportunity, I believe, to go forward. We also have a national framework for protecting Australia's children, and it's just about to run out, and I'm hoping there'll be a much better framework going into the future that is more about child wellbeing generally, rather than have a child protection lens. And we do have a national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. A bit pejorative. I mean, the children belong to the women, as opposed to in their own right deserve to be free from violence. However, there are many, many issues that should keep us awake at night, and I'm not shying away from those. In particular, the high rates of suicide and self-harm among children. Children's exposure to violence and abuse, it's the main driver of kids coming into the care and protection system. The number of children living in poverty, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children in care and justice systems, and just about any other indicator that we wouldn't be proud of. Increasing rates of child homelessness, the length of time children have spent in immigration detention now, even though there's not many kids left in immigration detention, closed immigration detention that is. Many of them were in that space for 4 or 5 years, and you know, the damage that does to the psyche of a little child is just awful to think that we've overseen that. And we've had recent changes to a lot of laws to do with counter-terrorism, citizenship and immigration that have all seemed to happen over Christmas when no one's looking, that actually disadvantage children and capture children into those laws. And structurally and critically, we remain, the problem remains that we have so much what I call missing architecture to address these kinds of issues for kids in Australia. So what is that? Well, we have no Human Rights Act, so we don't have all the scaffolding that would go with that, and including an education program for the community. So I really do think that's something we should really be seeking to advance in our advocacy. Perversely, all the current controversy around religious freedom and freedom of speech may very well push us into that direction. Interesting conversation, I think, to be had in that space. I recommended in the report a national plan for child wellbeing. That's something we need, and that should be underpinned by a national data framework. And I also recommended greater scrutiny for policy and budget developments and reviews that have child impact assessments built into them. But many other countries have things like children's rights acts, and that's something I think is not beyond us to put on the agenda. I think my time's basically up, and so I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion that ensues. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Obviously, we have a lot to cover today and just 1 hour. So many more things that could be said. Nanette is next, and just get these up. And Nanette has some photos from the exhibition that we're going to be showing and just rotating through while she presents. And there are some more photos that are going to be coming up later on during discussion as well. So thank you, Nanette.
Thank you. So just bear with me for 1 second when I get all my stuff together. So can you hear me? All good? Is this on? Yes. Fantastic. So I'd like to acknowledge the Guringai people as well today. Acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land that we're on, always was and always will be, and acknowledge the elders past and present and emerging. So I'm here to talk to you today about the Museum of Australian Democracy and our work in children's rights. Put up your hand if you've been to the museum before. Fantastic too. Oh, several? Great. I'd like to think, and I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to come to the museum to see the work that we're doing. We'd love to meet you and show you through spaces like Play Up, which is what I will talk to you about today. So Play Up, what is it? Play Up is a hands-on exhibition space for young people and families. It is designed as a creative framework for young people to come together to explore the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's also a space in which, as adults, we don't see ourselves as experts, we see ourselves as co-learners. So, and I guess it's within that constructivist framework of saying that we all bring knowledge to a space and really listening and learning from each other. So our staff operate from that perspective as well. They are specialists, but they're also co-learners in the space. So the other interesting thing about Play Up is it's really very much a space of sanctuary and safety. It's a very large, warm space. My colleague, Amy, who's over there as well, in the museum engagement team, waving. So we design that space ourselves. We have very little money, so we do all of the 3D design in that space. And we design it not to only, it's based on universal design principles. So if you're an adult or a child, you feel warmly welcomed in that space in terms of the physical design. So it is very much a space where our adults also feel comfortable there. It's really interesting in the research that we do in our space that we know that adults come together to meet with their friends as much as for their children to meet with their friends. So it's a site of social inclusion as well, which is really important. And we know that museums play an increasingly important role in communities in that way. So, so how did we become interested in children's rights? Well, I guess you would agree it's a no-brainer that democracy and children's rights go hand in hand, don't they? So this was a really good opportunity. In 2014, I got the chance, I guess, to interrogate how we could develop an exhibition space that would really connect with very young children. So we're in the business of lifelong learning, cradle to grave experience of learning, and we really wanted to talk about democracy with young children. But as you can imagine, it's you could be really earnest and really boring, and you could walk away because no disrespect to democracy, of course, because it's not boring, but it's not easy to make to make it really interesting. And we worked with someone. Her name is Dr. Barbara Piscatelli. Some of you may have heard of her before. If not, look her up. So she's one of Australia and the world's leading experts on family learning in museums. And she said to me, have you looked at the Convention on the Rights of the Child? And I said, yes, of course I've looked at the Convention on the Rights. And she said, go back and look again. So I went back and looked again and realised that actually that document is a suite of exhibitions. Almost every article is an exhibition waiting to happen. And it's not an on-the-wall exhibition, it's an interactive experience. So we can literally, in Play Up, it's the living embodiment of the CRC every single day, so, which is very exciting. So that became the framework for Play Up and will continue to be into the future. So we started with the Article 31, the right to play, which is a great beginning and quite a radical idea, like what Megan was saying. When you empower children to understand that the CRC exists, I agree with you, it is like an armour, and it's this radical idea, I have the right to play, I have the right to access to the arts. That's really powerful as well, and we continue to have that as a really significant thread as a part of what we do. We then moved on to look at the right to shelter. So we have a very, as you arrive in the space, we have an initial conversation about the convention as a whole, and then we step into a curated experience of one article. So the right to shelter, we started to get a bit edgier in our conversation at that point in time as well, because what we were looking at is not just what it means to have a home, it was also about what it means to not have a home as well. And young children are very astute. We always underestimate them as adults. They are extremely astute and responsive to issues where there's challenges as well, and we don't shy away from having those conversations in Play Up. And of course, in 2018, the exhibition is about the right, Article 12. So the right to speak and be heard is what we are focused on in there, and it is a tremendously exciting exhibition, and we're very proud. We won the Museums and Galleries Award last year. We won the best exhibition, best permanent exhibition in Australia, and that wasn't just for children's exhibition spaces, that was for adult exhibition spaces as well, so we're very proud of that. So why is Play Up successful, I suppose, is the question. Now, we were talking earlier on looking at numbers and success is not all about numbers, but it is really important. We know that Play Up represents 30% of all visitation to Moad. So that's pretty significant that 30% of the people coming into that building are coming for Play Up. What we also know is of those people, a lot of those are returning visitors. So it's not just coming once and I've done that. You come some people are coming weekly, we know that, and some people more than once a week. So that's really exciting. It becomes something much more than an exhibition space. It's incredibly dynamic. So that's really great. What we also have evidence of is it is diverse, and we have non-traditional audiences coming in as well, which is very exciting for us. So I guess, why is it successful? What is the secret to it? It is absolutely the convention on the right. That it's like puzzle pieces coming together. Children really get into that content very deeply, and it's such a great opportunity for all sorts of engagement that we do with young people. And I would like to acknowledge our Play Up facilitators. So where museums sometimes do what we call set and forget for children. They don't, like the cultural rights of children, and I'm making sweeping generalisations here, but can often be an afterthought. We've seen some examples of that recently here since we've visited here in Sydney. But it is so important. And what we do in that space is we really value that, and we don't set and forget. We have Play Up facilitators who every single day are engaging with young people in that space. And one of the ways that we do that is we have a craft activity, which is 10:30 to 12:30 every single day except Christmas Day. And everyone knows everyone by name. They come in and they will greet Brooke, who is our fantastic Play Up facilitator. We have other excellent people as well. They're on a first name basis, and every single day there is an experience. So every week we change over to a different UN International Day, or we focus on a local significant day as well. And we do a week of really exciting engagement around that. So it is, we have a big craft table where we can have up to 40 people around it at once, and it's like democracy in action, literally, when you see that. And it's quite a profound experience to be a part of. One of the other things that we do is we actually, our Play Up facilitators are also kind of action researchers as well. So every day they create a journal of their experience in that space. And what they're doing is, and that's a data set, by the way, that is, we have an enormous amount of content now, and it is very exciting because we're able to track really significant changes in children's development in their ongoing experience in the space. So yes, we do all sorts of things. So we celebrate things like the International Migrants Day, International Day of Women and Girls in Science, International Day of Human Spaceflight, World Tuna Day, World Bee Day, World Yoga Day, all sorts of exciting things that we do in there. So yes, it is an ongoing and exciting experience of the craft table, and I would encourage you, if you can, to come around 10:30 to see that in action. So look, I know I don't have much time to talk now either, and I will finish up with just an extract from a journal. This is the daily journal that our facilitators create. So this is about World Tuna Day. Just bear with me. And this is written by Brooke Treble. So today in Play Up, we continued making fish in celebration of World Tuna Day. Around 12 children participated, aged between 18 months and 4 years. Most children were interested in making fish, while a few younger children wanted to draw or practice cutting instead. 4 mothers also joined the craft session this morning, with one mother leaving her 2-year-old to play with a truck on the floor because Mummy wasn't finished making her fish yet. When I set up this morning, I was greeted by 4-year-old Lena and her grandmother, who have become weekly visitors to Play Up. Apparently, she made a beeline to Play Up this morning because Brooke's coming. Lena was particularly keen for crafting today, remaining at the table for 2 hours. While we constructed the fish, her grandmother and I asked Lena about the kinds of fish she eats at home. Salmon, flathead and prawns were her favourite, but she doesn't like tuna. And what would happen if we ate all the fish in the sea? First, she said that fish also live in lakes, so we'd eat those first. But then she said, I think the turtles would be sad, Grandma. They wouldn't have any friends left. She made 3 different kinds of fish, finger puppets, and then wanted to make a boat. As I began to explain a possible boat construction, another 4-year-old crafter butted in, announcing that he knew how to make a boat, and proceeded to show the rest of the table how to make a raft-like boat, complete with mast and flag. I was especially impressed with this crafter as he began as an incredibly shy boy with very little confidence in his abilities. Today I noticed that his skills have improved tenfold, and he also remained at the table for over an hour. This little boy belongs to a family daycare group run by Sonia, who is linked to 2 other family daycare providers that visit Play Up weekly, Betty and Pam. Sonia and Betty visited today to pick up some old, worn-out Play Up toys from previous iterations of the space, and we're extremely grateful. Betty exclaimed, "It's like Christmas in May. The toys donated will be shared around the family daycare groups in their particular community, and it was wonderful to see them go to a good home and to people that love and support our exhibition." Not long after, regular Play Upper Alexander arrived with his nana. Apparently he'd been hurrying her all morning to get to Play Up on time for craft. Today he sat with us at the table for around 45 minutes, which is unusual for him, and when I commented on his great cutting and drawing skills, his nana said that he'd been drawing non-stop at home. She said Play Up craft has a wonderful influence on his fine motor skills, sociability, and said that having me as a facilitator in the space has been a major draw card for visiting Play Up. So that's just one example, and that's daily. That's what's going on. So, you know, that's as I said, the living embodiment, I suppose, of the CRC, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
There's a few more photos we didn't get to see there from the exhibition, but we'll see some more during discussion as well. Sorry, that's right. Grab a drink. I mean, there's a lot of different themes to pick up on there, and I also want to leave some time for questions from the floor. But I guess one thing that really strikes me about what we've been talking about is this question of children's voices, and I guess what Megan also said about hearing about the idea of children's rights being something that gives children a sense of empowerment, just in that kind of concept itself. And I guess the idea of children's voices is also something that's central to the work that historians of childhood and youth do. And I wondered if our panellists might want to start by talking about, you know, what insights your work might bring to the work that historians do as well, and how you think historians might help to keep children's voices at the forefront of debates about children's rights as well.
I don't know much about historians. So, I mean, I think that the problem with children's voices is just not systematic. You know, there are sort of one-off projects, and so even in my role, I mean, there's no obligation for me under the Act that I'm formulated under to consult with kids, and if there was, there'd be some resources that flowed with it. So I think that's a sort of there's systems problems. That's not the case with all the states and territory commissioners, though. Many of them do have a mandate to talk to kids and to engage deeply with them. So I have made it a thing that I need to do because it's a really critical part of the convention, and the convention certainly is in my sights. So I did think I'd put up I don't know if you can find it, when we, and you know, so I'm always looking for creative ways to talk to kids, and creative and cheap ways, because I have no resources. So, and that's why I've developed lots of connections with schools and youth groups and things like that all around the country. And so any connection I can make, and if you can put me on to some, I'm really happy to kind of exploit you. That would be really good in terms of your connections with kids. But in this BTN, this Behind the News survey that we did, what's up there? Yeah, we reached nearly 23,000 kids, and you know, we've got quite a good representation of kids from non-English speaking backgrounds and from Indigenous kids. So everybody's watching Behind the News, watching the ABC. So, well, at least kids are. So that, I was quite pleased with that representation. But in terms of what they ranked, they said being safe, having a home and being cared for, and having a clean environment were their top 3 rights. And I think, you know, that's pretty obvious. But the being safe thing has actually become more prominent even in the time that I've been in the role, and that could be the discussions we have. It could be about kids feeling anxious about the world and you know, terrorism and things like that. I don't know what's behind that, so I don't know if historians could help in trying to unpack what's going on for kids and what's changed for them in their experiences. But the things that they said were least true for them in terms of rights was being treated fairly, being able to participate in decisions that affect them, and these were, and having access to accurate information, and I think that's really interesting in the current world where we have a lot of information but we don't know what's what. And they were most pronounced, the fact that that was the least true for them for Indigenous kids and kids from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So I think there's something in that tells us that certain kids aren't, you know, being able to access their rights more. Most kids were okay, and most kids said when we talked in workshops that they love Australia, they love the weather, they love the beaches, the bush, the animals. They like the fact that we have strong gun control laws. They like the fact that we have free education and health care. So, I mean, they're all aware of those things. They're pretty smart. So I'm not really answering your question about historians.
Sana, do you have comments, or perhaps also on the question there of the sort of question of which children get to have a voice as well? I don't know, Sana, if you might have any comments on that question as well.
I think I said quite a bit about that yesterday. I want to hear from Nanette on, you have a museum of democracy that is, people often assume museums are repositories of histories, right, and archives of materials, but what you describe in this is a very lively, contemporary, dynamic space. So from your work, what would you say to an audience of historians about, I'm going to put that question back on.
We'd love to work with you, is probably the answer. Look, you know, we are, as we always say, we're not experts at all. It is dynamic and vibrant, and we use young people as the guide to explore these kinds of things. I mean, we would be interested in having more conversations with historians, like certainly the team who is developing PlayUp, you know, really want to stay up to date with where things, you know, with all of your knowledge as well. So I suppose, you know, going back to what we think of as a traditional museum, we certainly aren't in PlayUp and never will be. We'll continue to be a really dynamic space, and I guess that would be a great site for research, I suppose. We've certainly got we're priming ourselves. Our PlayUp facilitators are essentially kind of researchers on the job. So there's a whole body of work there that can be tapped into. So yes, we're looking for ways in which to connect, to be part of the conversation. I don't know if I answered the question there, but
I mean, I think people who aren't aware, well, haven't been to the museum might not realise, but it's actually based in Old Parliament House. So it is also in a historical setting. And I think that's probably something interesting in terms of how the exhibition works in relation to people's experience of going to a museum that is also about the history of democracy.
Actually, I will answer something just really quickly on that, because we are Old Parliament House, and just thinking about Indigenous children, there are, and what you were saying about who misses out as a child. So we're a powerful symbol of something that is really challenging for Indigenous communities, and one of our weaknesses in PlayUp, for me, I guess, as a kind of curator of that space, is we've never done enough. We haven't done enough work. So we're looking, our next exhibition will be focused on Article 24 and 29. So we're really looking at the right to environment, like it's timely, it's ready to go, and young people are telling us that that's where we want to go. But we need to work harder in breaking down what our building means to Indigenous people as well, because it's, you know, it can be a negative symbol. So yes, that's I guess a point of exclusion, I suppose, arguably.
Perhaps one last question from me before we move to questions from the floor, and that is, we've talked about the idea of voice, the idea of participation, but of course the convention is also about protection. And I guess I wondered, something that we kind of explore in our histories too, is how those two discourses of protection and participation have sat alongside of each other in the history of rights. So I wondered, before we take some more questions, how do you think those two concepts sit in children's rights advocacy today, and how do they shape the work that you do? Open to anyone.
I don't see them in conflict with one another. I see them as mutually supporting each other. I mean, the convention does recognise that children have vulnerabilities because of their age. And when I talk to kids, I say, why should you have special rights? And what's different about you than adults? And they're able to tell me that they're not able to drive, they can't drink or smoke. And then they get around to they can't vote either. So they get it. But I think for all of those reasons, they lack power, and voice is part of that power. So I think that's the protection bit, and also their development. They're growing, and so we need to be aware of that. And the things that happen to them profoundly impact on their development if they're negative. So I think we've got to be very aware that they're growing little individuals, little citizens, and that's reasonable that we pay special attention to that developmental journey, and you know the damage that we can inflict as adults, or the environment can inflict on them if we're not careful. But at the same time, the participation thing is about giving them back some power during that developmental process. So I think it's really important that we see them as rights holders and citizens of the country, even though they can't do all those things that they identify themselves.
In my work, I would see, I do see a tension between protection and participation, but I see it in the process of the development of political subjectivities, which we spoke a little bit about yesterday. So if we think of the development towards a good liberal adult citizen, we are talking about the development of certain and particular kinds of competencies of rationality, competencies of maturity, of both physical and physiological and psychological forms and inhabited and performed expressions of autonomy, of the capacity to show that you have individual will and not just the inherited will of a parent or a guardian. So for me, at an abstracted level, there's a tension between the production of a political subject who can produce that subjectivity to acquire formal, full political citizenship rights, and protection discourses grounded in an acknowledgement that these are not competencies that all children hold. My critique, and that's where my critique is. So that's exactly the point I was about to make, which is what I think is important about understanding the tension then is about understanding how we use that tension, how that tension gets exploited and taken up in political debates and contestations led about adults without much reflection about what that tension means for political subjects generally. So adults are allowed to be irrational. Adults are allowed to be immature. Adults are allowed to act in ways that do not demonstrate individual free will, but they still get a voice, and they still get to vote, and they still get to stand for Parliament and be President of the United States. And so, so I think for me the tension is not a matter of irreconcilability. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, it is not a tension of good or bad. It is about understanding what that tension does in the way we talk about what rights children can and can't have.
Thanks, Sana. I think we might just see if we've